Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Club Book with Rita Woods. My name is Shannon Gibney, and I am a writer and teacher in Minneapolis. Before I introduce tonight's guest properly, allow me a moment to tell you a bit more about the unique series that is bringing her to us. Club Book is a program of MELSA, the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, made possible through Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and coordinated by Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. St. Paul Public Library is the co-organizer of this evening's talk. Thanks also to partnering bookseller Red Balloon Bookshop. A purchase link to Remembrance, which I cannot recommend highly enough, will be available in the comment section of this live stream feed. Have it shipped, pick it up at their lovely store in St. Paul, or have them deliver it personally to your door if you're in the area. Beautiful book. One final housekeeping note. Also in the comments, you'll see a survey link. MELSA would greatly appreciate hearing what you think of this club book program. It's quick and easy. And now, without further ado, let's get to Rita Woods. Rita Woods is the author behind Remembrance, one of the most celebrated historical fiction debuts in years. Woods' book straddles literary genres and historical epics. In this book, Remembrance is a hallowed refuge for escaped slaves, which exists outside the normal bounds of time and space. The most unusual stop on the Underground Railroad, Remembrance owes its existence to generations of women with secret supernatural abilities. Their personal stories span from the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to the last days of the New Orleans slave trade in the 1850s and up to the present. NPR lauds, Remembrance is well-researched, truly epic historical fantasy. Woods creates memorable characters in all her settings, each with a distinct purpose that helps make the impossible relatable. After a short reading by our guest and some initial questions from me, we'll have time for an audience Q&A. Simply drop your questions in the comments thread here on Facebook, and our tech manager will route them to me. If you prefer to ask a query a bit more anonymously, you can also send a private message to Club Book here on Facebook, or send an email to clubbookmn@gmail.com. So let's get started. Rita Woods, welcome.
Hi, Shannon. Thank you. I'm
Thank you
so
so
glad
much
to
for
be
being
here.
here.
Thank you. So I thought I would start with a short reading from Remembrance. Let me sort of lay the groundwork. It starts right on the eve of the Haitian Revolution, which was in 1791. And during that time, a lot of the masters, the planters, were sending their families to both Cuba and to the United States to safety for this brief interlude that they felt until they could get a handle on this revolution. And this is kind of where I'm just going to read a short passage where the woman who becomes Mother Abigail later in the story is being sent away with her mistress. For months, the rumors had drifted in the slave quarter, like ghosts, roiling through the coffee groves, gaining strength by the day, whispered from slave to slave, managing to penetrate even Abigail's fog of grief. There was a man, they said, a priest who had spoken to the spirits, and this man had declared war on the Blancs. He meant to drive them, every man, woman, and child, into the sea. Every night, they said, plantations burned and the Blancs were killed in their beds. The warrior Maroons carried as their standard, not a flag, but the head of a white baby on a pike. And they said when it was over, this war, when the last Blanc had been driven from the last cliff, there would not be a single slave left in Saint Domingue, only free Black men and women. And every day the cocoa fields and coffee groves grew emptier as the slaves melted into the mountains to join the fight. Revolte. Abigail moaned. She lay curled in a fetal position, hidden among the rigging and other ship stores that cluttered the aft deck. They'd been at sea 3 days, 5, since the night the mountains surrounding Firewater had finally exploded and what was left of her world had gone up in flames. She struggled to focus, but her memories of that night were broken, jumbled. Monsieur Roos appearing at her door, no waistcoat, blouse pulled free of his breeches, reeking of stale sweat and ordering her to the main house. Angry white men with guns crowding the halls. Monsieur Roos's study, watching her as she walked by, hatred and fear naked on their pale faces. Ninette Roos, her mistress, in the center of the drawing room, wringing her hands, her red hair matted and tangled, her yellow dress bright in the room. Revolte. They were leaving, taking the last ship from Port-de-Paix to someplace called Cuba and then on to New Orleans. They were leaving before the Maroons reached Firewater. But they did not include Thierry Roos. He would stay, stand with the other planters and defend his holdings. He had been good to his slaves and they would stand by him. He was sure of this. And they did not include her sons, Claude and Henri. There was no space for them on the ship, no accommodations for them in New Orleans. But Abigail was needed to look after the mistress and baby Julian. Abigail pulled her knees tighter to her chest. She had a vague memory of blocking her master's exit from the drawing room and screaming no into his startled face. She remembered falling and the taste of blood in her mouth. Had he struck her? She couldn't remember. She was stuck, frozen in that last moment with her boys, bending over their sleeping forms, inhaling their musty little boy's scent, touching her nose to theirs. She clawed at her face. She should have kissed their beloved faces and then slit their throats so that they would never know fear or sadness, not have to wait and hope for the freedom promised by the Maroons, for they would already have the one true freedom. But she had been a coward. She had let herself believe the master's promise that he would send them to his smaller estate in the south where it was safer. Let herself believe that she would see them again.
I'm letting out a big exhale, Rita, because that section, when I read it, was just as devastating as hearing you read it as well. There's so many themes in the book that we can pick up, but I think one of the most poignant, powerful, and difficult is the destruction of the Black family, through these ongoing systems of racial oppression. And it's always hard, but I think especially when it's children,
right?
It's really hard. I have so many questions for you. And I warned you before we started talking, so I'm still not going to get to all of them, but this is what happens when you write an arresting and complex and engaging novel. I'm just going to jump right in and ask you, why did you write this book? What, if anything, do you hope readers will get out of it?
So originally it started out, honestly, in a much simpler form. It was going to be more of a kind of a combination of coming of age and passing on the torch idea, sort of that generational story of, here's this woman, Mother Abigail, who has built this thing. She has created her legacy, but she's failing and wants to pass it on to an heir. And that heir does not appreciate it in the same way, doesn't value it in the same way. And so initially the story was going to be about the conflict between those two women. This woman who had something she loved dearly and wanted to see go forward into the next generations, and a woman who kind of sort of got it, but didn't have the same attachment to it. And that was Winter. But as I got deeper into their story, I realized that it was much bigger than that. And originally that just started with, where did Mother Abigail get her power? And that sort of led me into the study of Udon, and then where did that come from Haiti? And then it just kind of grew from there. And I have to say, as someone who writes with a historical bent, even though it's speculative fiction, I always want people to take away, yes, this was a good story, but did you know this history? I want them to to find out about a piece of history they may have heard a little bit about, but become much more invested in it because now they're invested in these fictional characters.
It just an interesting genre mix too of the historical and the speculative. That's not something that I myself see that much or encounter that much. So I really appreciated that as well. Can you take us into your process of writing, researching, and revising this book? What was the impetus? How did it develop? Did you always know that it would be multiple timelines in multiple places with multiple protagonists? What kind of research did you do? Was it mostly bibliographic? Also, was it experiential? Toggling between various timelines is very difficult to do well. I know this myself, especially while maintaining the narrative tension throughout. How did you do this?
So I'm a research nerd, and I have to say that I'm not a fast writer for a number of reasons, but one very important one is that I tend to disappear down these rabbit holes. Like I'll be supposedly researching the Underground Railroad history in Ohio, and then I get all caught up in the churches and the railways. And I was telling someone I'm writing a novel now, and I ended up spending 45 minutes researching how do you attach those collars in the 1920s to shirts. That has nothing to do with anything, but I just got totally sidetracked. And so for someone like me, it's very easy to get, wow, this is so fascinating. So originally Haiti was going to be this just kind of a stepping off point, but the history of Haiti is so rich. And then of course, there's these threads that connected to New Orleans, and New Orleans, everybody, New Orleans is a character in and of itself. But there were so many things that just when I want to look into it for historical accuracy that you find out about. Like I had never heard of Réveillon, and I thought, well, that's got to be in the book. And just this whole kind of topic. So some of the research process for me usually starts, like for everybody, it starts on Google, but then the upside of that is you do find links to historical societies, and like there's a significant Haitian diaspora here in the United States. The amount of information available on 1700s and 1800s New Orleans is limitless. There's whole societies that do nothing but study the placage system in New Orleans. So that was that portion of it. I actually have traveled to Ashtabula and that area. And so I had a very visual cue of what that area looked like, which is where kind of Remembrance is sort of set physically in the book. So it was a combination of things, I did reach out to some people, people who were native French speakers, who told me that everything that I had written just made absolutely no sense because I'm not a French speaker. And they're like, I don't think that's what you meant. It's like, this is what happens when you learn to speak French on Google. So there was a combination of that. And there's also like professional organizations that I reached out to, and everyone, when you're writing and you reach out to someone about something they're interested in, they would be more than happy to spend lots and lots of time telling you about, how wooden buttons were made in 1791. There's actually clubs of people who that's all they spend time doing. So that was kind of my process.
It sounds very in-depth, laborious. I mean, I hate to use that word laborious because, when you're doing what you love, it's not labor. Right. How long did it take you to put the book together?
So it probably took about a year and a half.
Oh, that's fast.
Well, the original version. And then it just kind of went from there. And the book was actually bought in that version. But I full disclosure, the modern character, Gael, did not exist. And that was something that had to be kind of added sort of at the behest of the editors. And as you know, as a writer, once you pull one thread, the whole thing starts to come apart. Like, well,
Yep.
that doesn't make any sense because that person died already. So you have to almost do this rewriting thing. So then there was probably another 7 or 8 months of that where we had to create a whole new character and then make it actually make sense so that it didn't look like I had just kind of slapped her on there and like, what does she have to do with anything? So that was the process. So probably altogether 2 years to get the whole thing
That's
together.
pretty quick for a novel of this scope and length, actually. Yeah, I'm impressed. Um, in our pre-talk check-in, you shared that you're not part of the Haitian diaspora. As you know, the religion and practice of voodoo has been very much maligned and misunderstood by white Western US culture. How did you approach representing and exploring it on the page, given this context and your social location as, quote unquote, a cultural outsider?
So I have to say that I I already had a kind of a knowledge that there was a significant misrepresentation. That said, I did not have a whole lot of in-depth knowledge of Udon, but I knew that it was not, I knew that it was a religion, and I knew that it wasn't about people sticking pins in dolls and biting the heads off chickens. Um, and part of that, the approach was that I wanted to approach it very sympathetically and respectfully. And that was also one of those teaching moments of, I want other people to see that this isn't this Hollywood Bela Lugosi version that has been put forth by Hollywood. I was a little, or more than a little, taken aback at how intentional that misrepresentation was. So Voodoo itself, it became an issue of realizing that it is an amalgam and a defense mechanism of Western African spiritual practice melded into French Catholicism as a way of protecting their culture, because it kind of goes undercover, right? The saints were just appropriated and just kind of stuck into the pantheon of their little mini gods, and their little mini gods were their gods were sort of presented as saints, which was palatable to their French owners. That said, I did not have an awareness that, Thomas Jefferson was so anti-Haitian, and that there was a huge PR campaign in the United States to demonize voodoo. I guess it made sense because they felt very much like that was the origin or the catalyst that had created this slave revolt, and they were terrified. They, meaning the United States, was terrified that this was going to be contagious. And so it was a very systemic effort to bastardize and change how voodoo was perceived in the United States and in the entire Western Europe as well. And I wanted to kind of, without being didactic, because it is fiction, provide a sort of counter narrative to that.
Thank you. And it's also interesting. I mean, it's like somebody like me who doesn't know that much about voodoo. It's like it feels like there's elements of it, but I remember that one scene where Mother Abigail asked Josiah, well, what is this magic? Is it voodoo? And he kind of laughs at her and is like, it's yes, no, maybe so. Like, right. Just open, typical Josiah answer, like, open your mind, right? Like, it's everything, and so that was an interesting moment too, that like, okay, there are these very kind of, cultural touchstones of Haitian culture and voodoo, but it's also something else going on in the book as well, especially with the speculative elements. And this is a spoiler, like the book has been out for 2 years, so I feel like, if you haven't read it yet, that's kind of, Got to make a priority of that. So I don't feel bad, but I'm just letting y'all know in case you want to mute, just in case. At the end of the book, Josiah comes to Gail and says, the world needs a protector. And so as readers, we have a feeling that like Mother Abigail and Winter, Gail is going to come into her own magic and power in the service of Black people and the underdogs like Toya who have lost everything. Could you speak on that? How is Remembrance a story of Black female power and agency to save and protect Black communities across time, space, and place? Did you know this was what it was about when you began the project, or did it evolve?
I think it evolved. I knew that I wanted it to not just end at the Civil War. I knew that I didn't want that. I wanted it to be more generational. You know, we have that belief in our community about, you know, we are the dream that our ancestors dreamed. And I wanted a sort of a sense of that we can reach back. And I think that again is very West African, Haitian, et cetera, where we reach back, and the past is never really the past. Our ancestors are always there looking over us. But I wanted that personified. I was also clear in the beginning that I didn't want somebody to rescue us. You know, these women had horrific things happen to them, devastating things, but they were not victims. They were the owners of their destiny. That, you know, they could have chosen to be destroyed by their despair, but instead it empowered them. And I knew that I wanted that. But as the story evolved, I thought this, you know, wouldn't it be wonderful if this was a legacy passed from woman to woman through generations, that there was always this person to look out. Not necessarily someone who can change the trajectory in big ways, but who's always sort of there with an eye as to bear witness to oppression, to bear witness to injustice, and when possible to change the trajectory of that. And so that sort of became, particularly once I added Gael, you know, as the modern character, it became clear in my mind that that was her purpose, that she was the bearer of the torch.
Yeah, that was a really beautiful moment at the end, because I didn't necessarily see it coming. I didn't necessarily see the novel ending there. And as a reader, I always like that. I always like that element of surprise, like, you know, and that feeling at the end when you're like, oh, of course it couldn't have ended any other way, right? But I couldn't see it in that moment right until the end. So I thought that was masterfully done. In this vein, how does Remembrance fit into or not fit into the venerable tradition of Black women fiction writers writing the stories of powerful, outcast Black women? And here I'm thinking of Zora Neale Hurston, Gail Jones, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Paul Marshall, and so many others. And do you see your work as speaking to and or part of this tradition?
That's, you know, that I don't even want to be presumptuous enough to think that my name can, you know, be attached to that pantheon, but yeah, sure. Yeah, that's me. I'm just like them.
Ask you up the question, it's like, why not partake?
Yeah, let's go with that. Yeah. The thing that I think that is a commonality among all those writers is there is always the thing that will destroy you. There is always that moment where, given the right set of circumstances or a different kind of woman or a different kind of person, the thing that happens could just rip you apart. And essentially that would be the end of the story. It's like, I have nothing to go on for. But I think the thing that is common in all of those stories is that will not only to live, but to survive and to thrive in spite of. You know, you read that people like J. California Cooper, and these people have accomplished all of this stuff, and they built this ranch, and then, and they want to pass it down to their children, and then it gets stolen from them. They could just give up at that point, but they don't. in obviously in The Color Purple, she could just, all of these horrific things happen to her. But in the end, ultimately, she triumphs. It's like, that sort of saying that we say in medicine, it's, I'm hard to kill, and I think that's the commonality is, as Black women, we are hard to kill. And we are going to, you can keep trying, but we are going to triumph. So I think that's the common thread that I think Black women writers sort of have through their stories.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I've never heard it quite put that way before. So we're hard to kill. I'm gonna hang on to that. My last question, and then we'll go to audience questions. Now I understand you're a family physician. Am I right?
Correct.
Okay, so I mean, I know quite a few fiction writers, and I have to say you're the first one I've met who is a family physician. It's very interesting. And congratulations on your ability to move between, two really different fields. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, how does a family physician come to fiction writing? How do you balance these two dominant professions in your life?
So I always tell people that being a physician is about being a storyteller to some degree. When people come to you, they come to you and they might not even know what's wrong. So part of our job is that we have to, and I will tell patients this sometimes, especially when they're hitting me with 900 pieces of fact. It's like, I need to be able to tell a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and the end. What is it that you're coming here for? When did it start? What's going on now? And then we'll figure out the end. So I mean, that's sort of my job, my day job is trying to make a whole bunch of facts fit into a story, into a narrative that makes sense that I can do something with. And it's similar in fiction. If you have all these pieces of information, oh, the collar's attached here, and do you know where kerosene comes from? Let's talk, and turpentine comes from a pine tree. That's all interesting, but otherwise it's just noise if you can't put it into a narrative that's interesting. So for me, storytelling was a natural I always wanted to be a writer, but my mom said I should be a doctor instead. So, that's a whole nother story. But you use some of the same skills, right? In terms of balance, I just need to be honest with people. I'm always in imbalance, to be perfectly honest. I can't speak for everyone, but I can certainly speak for myself that you can't do it well all the time. There are days that things just get lost. There's that whole thing. Well, if you want to be a writer, you have to put your butt in the seat and just write every day. Yeah, no, the dog is throwing up on the carpet. I've been up all night.
I so appreciate you saying that because I also feel like as women, like I'm like, why is it only men that I hear say that? Like
because
no
they have
women writers I know will ever say that. Like
no.
I mean, you can't do that.
No.
Who does that?
No. Because you're the one when the kid eats the crayon that they come to and say, well, what am I supposed to do? Okay, I'm writing. But I think that sets up this whole dynamic of you start to feel bad about yourself. And like, I haven't written in 4 days and I am trying to make a leprechaun house instead of writing pages. And then you feel bad and think, well, then I must not be a real writer because I don't sit down every day and write. And then, there's days when I come home and basically I'm a rutabaga. I can't think of any word. I have no words, I can't do the words. And you have to give yourself grace to be able to do that and still believe I'm a writer. I just have a different process. And until I have a wife, it's just going to be like this, So
I really appreciate the realness. I saw this tweet, it cracked me up. It went viral where this woman writer was saying that she was talking to one of her really good writer friends who was a man, and he was basically encouraging her to do what he did, which is get up every morning and write like really early and write for 5 hours. As she was saying in the tweet, as she was saying in the tweet, and that told me everything I needed to know about who does all the housework and, all the stuff around the house. And I just think, as you say, you're a storyteller, both in the medical profession and, in the fictional environment. And it's like, these stories can be very harmful actually about like what a real writer
Right.
is and what a
Right.
real writer does. Like,
Right.
and what kind of social location, right? Like enables people to have those kinds of choices. And it's messy. I mean, every woman writer I know, and especially sort of the more levels of complexity to their identity they have, if they're a person of color, if they're differently able, if they're queer, if they're poor, right? It's like it just gets more and more like this is not gonna work for me. So I appreciate you keeping it real with us about that. I'm gonna go to a question on Facebook. Why did you choose to write the book in a non-sequential chronological order? What did the going back and forth add to the narrative?
It felt to me that these were initially very different stories. And I needed to be very true to that story and very in that moment and have the reader invested in those characters very independently, with the thought being, if I pulled Gael out and you only read her story, that you would still be invested. If I pulled Margot out, you would still be invested. And I sort of saw that as those, like one of those movies like Crash, where you get to know all these characters and at first you're not sure how they're related. And then they become braided much later as the story goes on, they become braided, but now you're invested in each one individually. And once they come together, they're braided into a single narrative that you become invested in. And so I think it was more, people give writers, and I can only speak for myself, give writers a lot more credit for having control than they do, at least for me. It just seemed the right thing to do as it went along. It certainly wasn't something that I sat down and went, I have this brilliant idea. No, it was only as I went along, like, no, I need to know these characters better. And if I know them better, then I think my readers will know them better and actually care, so that when they come together, there's a much bigger payoff.
For me as a reader, it was surprising the ways in which they came together, because I didn't necessarily see it coming, which as a reader I like. When just kind of like winter showed up, right? Like, what is it, like a third of the way through, maybe a fourth like I didn't, and she's like a major character in the book, right? So that's like a lot of patience as a writer to wait to introduce a major character like that. And then, sort of like, well, how is she related to Gail and Josiah and all of these? And that's part of the pleasure, I think, of reading the book, right? But we can't experience that pleasure unless we're actually, as you say, invested in the characters. So we got another question submitted before our talk. I appreciate that so many important parts of this book are not centered in the United States, which is the case for most of the pre-1900 historical fiction I read. Which leads to my question for Ms. Woods. How has this book been received internationally?
That's been a really interesting question. So there's been, my agent we've been shopping it in Europe, and most of the kind of the conflict of it has been in Western Europe, they see this as kind of a Caribbean story. And despite the fact that so much of it takes place outside the United States, they see it as either a Caribbean story or a story of the United States. So where it's been, right now, we don't have a big, huge international rights. We're still working on that. But that has been the issue, which is really interesting considering that, France is involved and all of that. But I think people still see, the international community, just many degrees, still see slavery as an American issue. They forget, about Portugal and Spain and France. or it's a Caribbean issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to put anything on the Europeans, right? But I mean, it's a colonial history that I'm sure, it's not a good history. So I'm
No,
sure it
no.
in some ways it's like, mm, it might not be people's top priority to kind of embrace the complexity and the difficulty of how these colonial adventures, affected the rest of the world, right? Like,
Right,
so
right.
that could also be a factor. And I'm sure it is. Another question from a reader. Which historical period was your favorite to write about? Which generation was the hardest to write and why?
My favorite. Honestly, I think the New Orleans portion was my favorite, mostly because New Orleans has this really strange and convoluted history. And again, I thought I knew history as a history nerd, but the whole right around that time, that 1790 to 1840s period, I don't think I realized that at the beginning of that, New Orleans was Spanish. And then it really wasn't French until much, much later. And then Americans were thought of as like kind of trashy. Um, they weren't allowed to be buried in good cemeteries. They weren't part of the upper class. If you married an American, you were kind of like, oh, I'm sorry. Um, so I found that very, very fascinating. Um, and there was just so many traditions in New Orleans because of the fact that it was Spanish and then it was French and then finally much later American. So that was one of my favorite parts to write about. Um, the most difficult was probably the Haiti issues, the Haiti time period. Not difficult to write because it wasn't interesting, but because it still resonates. Haiti is still struggling with all of that historical baggage that they had. And I would find myself getting very angry, as I'm writing and doing more research, and then realizing, every time that people refer to Haiti, it's always the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and I'd be typing, yelling at the computer like, well, why? you know and you can't write enraged. There has to be a little bit of distance, because again, it's not a textbook, so I just wanted to keep it in context, but at the same time it was hard to read some of that history and not just, well, and I did sometimes have to walk away from it, let cool down. And I think that's the problem, or the risk of writing historical fiction anyway, is that the more you drill down, the more you find out, and the more you find out isn't always the party line, you know the the quotes that we say to make ourselves feel good. And you find some ugly truths, and sometimes it's hard to write that, to talk about the truth without all of that seeping into the actual narrative, because that's not what it's truly about.
Well, especially right now when there's so much going on in Haiti and with
Yeah.
Haitian refugees. And I mean, it's just, yeah, it's never ended. And this whole idea of like what you say, yeah, it's always referred to as like the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, right? But it's also not referred to as like the first Black Republic. Like
Right, they
those
don't
things,
refer to it that
like
way. Exactly.
you can't separate those two things, in white supremacist worldview. Like it just
Well, and
doesn't.
you say, oh, it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. You know, France demanded a $21 billion payoff, to leave them alone, which was not paid off until 1947. So there's kind of some reason, that's just never mentioned. It's just kind of glossed over.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Um, Next question is, did any libraries or particular librarians play a role in your research process?
Not so much. I have to say that most of the research was either online or reaching out to, um, members of certain societies, like, New Orleans has a, historical society. St. Louis Cathedral has, kind of an architectural society. There's a historical society for Underground Railroad in Ashtabula, which is a small town in Ohio. So I tended to reach out more to historical societies, or members of organizations that had some particular interest, like I said, the Underground Railroad, or the Haitian diaspora, or there's a woman who is Haitian, but she does these YouTube videos to try to teach you kind of Haitian Creole and Haitian culture. Like, this is, food we eat, and this is how you say this, and talk about their religion. So I kind of subscribe to her podcasts and things like that. So not libraries so much, not that I love libraries, I'm a library board member, but in this particular case, it was more, I didn't want the reading so much as, I wanted to see photos and talk to people who were sort of still actively involved in things. So.
Thank you. Next question is, as someone who has studied the history of Hispaniola at the U, I appreciated your portrayals of Haiti. What background research went into Remembrance? You talked a little bit about this, but maybe a little.
Yeah, so, people always ask, well, why is, Haiti is half of an island, it's Hispaniola. So you have the DR on one side and Haiti on the other, and there's a huge financial difference between the two. Well, one was Spanish and one was French. And on the one side, on the French side, they fought for their freedom and won it, but then they were extorted. So it was just a very, very different historical arc. That said, the other side of Hispaniola, the DR, has been very less than cordial to Haitians as well. Anyone that wanted to, to immigrate, they put up barriers. You can't come here. So they've, it's not exactly like they see themselves as one people. And I'm not saying that I'm not suggesting that they should, but again, there's this very real historical context in which you have to view Haiti. And to your point, it continues on. It still continues to resonate to this day. The kind of the egregious treatment of Haitians, and it's not really, it shouldn't be a surprise on some of the issues that they've had to labor under.
Yeah, it just, the time and the history just keeps going, right? It keeps reverberating. Another reader asks, have there been any rumblings about adapting Remembrance for the screen? Who would be your dream casting for Abigail or Margot?
So I would love to have like Angela Bassett for Abigail. She's so regal and kind of, she can be so cold and read off as queenly. And I see Mother Abigail that way. She's walled herself off to protect herself from her grief and despair, and channeled that into something really magnificent. And somebody like Ruth Neggi as Margot. So, I do know that my agent is talking to people, has talked to people in Hollywood. They haven't called. I'm still waiting. But yeah, so I would love, there's a lot of amazing actresses that I think would be great, but I see those two in those two particular roles.
Yeah, as I understand it, like, it's just can feel completely random, right? Like, it can just be like, oh, nothing. Hey, guess what? Netflix wants to do a 3-part miniseries on your blah, blah, blah for next year. And it's like, what? So it's just from 0 to 500.
I would be okay with that.
You would be okay with that. Okay, good.
I would be okay with that. Yeah.
All right. So everybody listening, just spread that around.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question. What tips would you give to a pre-published author who is balancing a demanding day job and family with the urge to write?
So I had this patient once who was a VP for Starbucks, right? And she gave me one of the best pieces of advice just for life, not just writing, but for life. And I try to use it, but again, referring back to what we talked about earlier, is being kind with yourself and gentle with yourself, and not beating yourself up that you're not getting your 5 hours. And what is that? 5 hours of writing? That has never happened in my life. But
I know, was he lying? Like, that's not even, I mean, it could have been like, it could have been 3, but even 3 every morning?
yeah,
Come on now.
it's like, so I would get up at 4, but the kids go to school, have to get up. So what are you saying, man?
And then your kids hear you up. So then they get up.
Right.
There's no way
Absolutely.
to win. You can't do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No.
But I think you have to be, gentle with yourself and realize what the limitations of your job are. So whether you're teaching or a lawyer or, work in the post office, you have to be it is what it is. You have to keep the lights on. That said, the piece of advice this VP gave me was, whatever the limits that you can find in your schedule, put it in your planner just as if it were a business meeting. So if it's like from 7 to 7:45, and that's the best you can do, put it in your planner, and it's sacrosanct. If it were your boss who said, well, we have a meeting at 9:15 and 9:45, and somebody called and said, the cat is throwing up, you'd be like, dude, I can't handle that right now. I'll get back to you. She said, look at it the exact same way. So if you're like, it's from 6:45 until 7:30, this is my writing time. Unless there's blood or smoke, you just, that's your time. And there may be days when there is blood or smoke and you have to deal with it. But at least you have that kind of set around as your time. The other thing that I think is really important, invaluable, you have to find your people. That might only be 1 or 2 people, but you have to find people who also want to write, who are also, critical readers that you can get together with. It might only be once a month, 2 hours once a month. But I think that does 2 things. Number 1 is it gives you a deadline against which to push. It's like, oh, it's the last Sunday of the month. I have to have at least 2 paragraphs written. But it also gives you people that kind of are in your own headspace, that can look at what you're writing, have critical thinking, and say, this is what works for me and this is what doesn't. But I think you have to have a network of people that value writing as much as you do.
And just to kind of, push a little further on that, how does one go about creating a network like that, do you think?
So depending on what it is you write, I mean, there's, again, sort of getting back to there's a group for everybody, there's romance writing groups. There are historical fiction writing groups. There are memoir groups. And if you go online, you can go on Twitter, you can go on Instagram, Facebook. I'd say more Twitter has that. I think Twitter is like ADD kind of thing, but it is valuable for that. And I can't tell you how welcoming writers are to other writers, even new writers. And a lot of them, or libraries, sometimes bookstores, now that they're starting to open back up, a lot of them will have writers groups. I know people that I've met that started their own, like, okay, we've met. You can join if you write children's. There's Siwa, and they have their own critique groups. So I would start with that, just to sort of get used to it. Most of them will say, we're going to have a write-off on Sunday for half an hour. NaNoWriMo, which I don't do, also has Nano Camp, where you get to meet people and they have local groups. So I would start with that.
Thank you. What's your favorite genre to read? Any new books that should be on our radar?
Oh my gosh, I'm reading so much stuff. Or I'm not supposed to be, but I am. So I kind of love fantasy, but not high fantasy. I like, kind of low fantasy, kind of magical realism. So TJ Klune has a new book out. He did House on the Cerulean Sea, and he has I think it's called Something Under the Door. It just came out maybe a week ago. I'm reading When Stars Rain Down by Angela, Jackson, and I want to read Love Letters from W.B. Du Bois. But I like a lot of books that I like it to have a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of magical realism, but it has to almost always has to have some sort of historical component as well. Because I just, again, I'm a geek nerd person. So I love finding out about new things. So
from one blurred or black nerd to another, I salute you. That's the blurred salute.
You're blurred, yeah, right?
So we have another question here. We're nearing our end time, but we've got another one. A question from Facebook. Comment first. Thank you for writing this beautiful book. Do you have plans to write more? Asking hopefully, and you did mention that you're working on a new book. I know writers, there's very different philosophies about this. I know people, it's almost, superstitious, like people don't like to talk about it too much. And then some other of us who are very loquacious could just go on about it forever. So I don't know how much you would want to share, but I was going
to actually have a book coming out September of 2022.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that we're actually, it's actually already, they're working on the artwork and all of that.
Congratulations.
And that's called, thank you. And that's called The Last Dreamwalker. And it is about a young woman in her 20s who's estranged from her mother. And she's always thought that she's had some kind of mental illness. But when her mother dies, she finds out that it isn't, but that she actually has a power that she's inherited from her ancestors who are Gullah Geechee. And she gets caught up in this battle with her Gullah Geechee ancestors and her family. She has the ability to walk in dreams and manipulate them and bring them back into the real world.
Wow.
So
that's amazing and also kind of scary. Like, yeah.
So that'll be out September 2022.
Okay, so. Great. So a year from now.
Right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Excellent. Whew. Okay. Now he's got something for us. The commentator says, yay. And yay is in all caps with 2 exclamation marks. So yes, exactly. Thank you for whetting our appetite with that. I'm actually going to close it down here. Thank you so much, Rita, for bringing us your energy and your brilliance and your warmth. We unfortunately, because of Zoom, can't all be in, because of Zoom. It's not Zoom. Zoom's not the cause of COVID, but because of the pandemic, we can't all be in the same room, but we can definitely feel your warmth through the Zoom screen, and look forward to the time when you can come visit with us in the Twin Cities, which you may or may not know is one of the readingest cities in the country. We love
that needs to be on your license plate.
Yes, it does actually. There's a lot of book nerds here, so that could go a long way. So we hope at some point we can actually have you here in person. This has been a virtual presentation of Club Book, a long-running literary series of MELSA made possible by the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Special thanks again to St. Paul Public Library for the part they played in bringing Rita to us. Before you log off, look for the Club Book survey link, which is in the comments and will be projected in place of my video momentarily. Lastly, consider joining Club Book on Monday, October 4th, for a talk with New York Times bestselling thriller novelist Mary Kubica. This one will be co-hosted by Anoka County Library. And as always, it's free. They'll be right here on Facebook Live. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you again, Rita.
Thank you.
Bye.